Okay, so hopefully the recording has started. I did select it. So as I say, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our In Conversation event this afternoon. Just a quick introduction to our speakers. Rachel is delayed at the moment in traffic, so we're hoping that she will be with us shortly. But just a quick introduction to our speakers. So Dr. Rachel Clarke is an NHS palliative care doctor and writer who lives in Oxfordshire with her husband and 2 children. Rachel, as you will probably know, is the author of 3 Sunday Times best-selling non-fiction books. Breathtaking, which reveals what life was really like working on NHS COVID-19 wards during the first wave of the pandemic. Dear Life, based on her work in a hospice, which explores love, loss, grief, dying, and what really matters at the end of life. And Your Life in My Hands, which documents life as a junior doctor on the NHS front line. Before going to medical school, Rachel was a broadcast journalist, and she produced and directed current affairs documentaries, primarily for Channel 4, focusing on subjects such as Al-Qaeda, the Iraq War, and the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She began her medical degree at the age of 29, qualifying as a doctor in 2009. Rachel writes for a number of publications, including The Guardian, Sunday Times, New York Times, Independent, New Statesman, and others. She makes regular television and radio appearances on, for example, BBC Question Time, BBC Radio 4, Today, BBC Newsnight, Channel 4 News, and others. Professor Mark Taubert. So Mark is a palliative medicine hospital consultant and clinical director at Valindra University NHS Trust. His teaching and research activities at Cardiff University include acute palliative care, using new media in clinical settings and decision-making processes with regard to future care planning. He's the founder of talkcpr.com and chairs a national strategy group that aims to improve understanding on advanced care planning. And I see Rachel's now joined us, and I'd just like to welcome you, Rachel. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And I'll hand over now to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And John, I've been furiously letting people in the lobby, and I've found a really good trick to do so. So if you've got, there was like 29 people waiting in the waiting room. So if you click on that and then click on at the top, admit all, then does it for you, because I was doing it individually earlier. So that was fun.
Thank you, Mark.
That was good. So they'll probably still pop up. Rachel, yay, you made it.
Hello, by the nick of time. The M25 is not a good strategy when you're trying not to be late for something. So hello and sorry.
M25, absolute classic. Quick one, John, as well. If you can keep a lookout for attendees, often what happens with me is when I join a meeting, I sometimes forget to switch the camera off. And that can just happen. And so sometimes I think people, when newly come into the meeting, their camera might be switched on. You can then right click on the person who's got the camera on, and then I think it says disable camera, and then they disappear. I've just done that with Piotr. Sorry, Piotr. So he's gone.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
Cool. So Rachel, lovely to see you. You remember last time we saw each other was in Edinburgh. And the time before that, I think, was in Telford. So we've done England, we've done Scotland, we're doing Wales now, and the next one is going to have to be Northern Ireland, isn't it?
I like it. And then Peru.
And Peru, oh yeah, that would be a nice one. Yeah, without the air miles, so we'll have to go there in a rowing boat or something. I remember the last thing we said to each other was we never get a quiet moment to talk to each other properly.
Is this that quiet moment?
Yeah.
It's just an intimate chat.
An intimate chat, exactly. Ignore that there's a few people around us as well. And I thought John would be fantastic at chairing the session, but I'm also later on going to bring Idris in as well, Idris Baker, who's our Welsh clinical lead for the Palliative and End of Life Care Programme Board, and I'm sure he'll have a few good questions for you from a sort of Welsh perspective. But yeah, lovely to see you, Rachel, and yeah, just to kick things off a little bit. if I sound a bit funny, I've got a mouth ulcer, by the way. So my first question, Rachel, have you got any good advice for mouth ulcers?
Do you know, I have the best advice for mouth ulcers.
Oh,
so
really?
there is this thing called Iglu, IGLU, which is a bit like Bonjela. You can buy it from a normal pharmacy, but it's magic because you put it on, and unlike most mouth ulcer creams, it doesn't sting, but it does anaesthetize. And we actually, in the last hospice where I worked, we used to buy industrial amounts of Iglu from pharmacies. You can't get it on an NHS prescription, and it's magic for mouth ulcers.
I'd never heard of this before. That's amazing.
IGLU, it's incredible. I feel like I'm not paid by Big Pharma, but if anything, I should be paid by Big Iglu, because best thing for patients with mouth ulcers. And now you, Mark.
I can see a critical Daily Mail or Telegraph article coming up from someone.
The scandal of the big Iglu influencer. Yeah,
absolutely. Betrayed herself as Big Pharma now. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, they're quite miserable at times. It's okay at the moment, but I'll occasionally take a little swig of water. But yeah, so I'm sure people are not here for the mouth ulcer content, so I'll get on to some of the proper questions.
Sure. I feel like, any minute now, you might want to discuss your hemorrhoids. Is there any other sort of complicated little issue we could raise in public?
I mean, again, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, no, we'll leave that. I think we'll move swiftly on. Basically, I think. I don't want to leave people with too many visual images at this point in the meeting. Maybe towards the end we can come back to that one again. But yeah. So Rachel, I just wanted to start off with, lots of people know you from the media. Lots of people know your books. The first time I ever heard about you was actually from my neighbor Trevor. So my neighbor Trevor popped over and had a chat, and he said, "Oh, do you know that Dr. Rachel Clarke?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Wow, she's written this amazing book, Your Life in My Hands," and he'd sort of read it, and he was in his 80s, basically, avid reader, basically, and that's the first time I ever heard of you, basically. And then I started seeing that your Twitter output and some of the amazing articles you've written in The Guardian. Truly prolific output, fantastic writer. But you didn't start out in medicine, did you?
No, so I was, as a kid, earliest memory of anyone saying, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I wanted to be a writer. I used to draw pictures of myself sitting at a desk writing, and I remember we did this. We had to do an all about me book at the age of 8, and you had to say what you wanted to be. And again, I was going to be a writer, and that was simply because I loved stories. I loved reading. I was a mad reader from a very early age, and my Dad had this room which he grandly called the library, but was basically a cupboard that contained the ironing board and the Hoover, a sort of walk-in cupboard lined with books. And I used to just
see you under the stairs now. Yeah,
totally. And I used to go in there from a really early age and read incredibly inappropriate material because it was all there. So I used to read, there was this writer called Harold Robbins, who in the kind of 60s and 70s wrote these sort of slightly, I wouldn't say soft porn, but very inappropriate for a kind of junior school child age. And I used to just read all this stuff, anything and everything, and I loved stories. And then I thought the way to change the world was through words, that journalists can do the most incredible good by bringing stories to light that really matter. And that's what I wanted to do. But so I became a journalist and loved journalism in many ways, but actually the day-to-day interactions that you have with people, if you are sort of trying to develop a relationship with trust with them, and the end point of that relationship is persuading them to appear on the documentary you're making for Channel 4, for example, which was what I did. It's complicated, and I realised that oh dear, that's probably the issues with your alimentary canal. So I eventually came round to the idea that although I did love all of these things about journalism, it didn't quite fit with who I was. And my dad, my granddad, lots of my relatives were or had been doctors and nurses, and always nagging away at me was this thought that that's what I should have done, that's what I would have really loved. So just before my 30th birthday, I went to medical school.
Wow, okay. And yeah, I mean, what was that transition like? I mean, I'm just thinking when you said that just now, the transition from journalism to medical school and then doctor. I mean, you're going essentially from, you know, dare I say it, one of the most unpopular professions to one of the most trusted professions, really. Was that all a bit much?
Well, the interesting thing was it didn't feel like a risk, in the sense that I told myself sort of really clearly, if it all goes wrong and you don't like it, you can just go back to this career that on paper is a, you know, is a good is a good career. You've done well at it. You can just go back to it, and you have to sort of tell yourself a story like that when you're taking a big leap into the unknown, in case you get it wrong. But most people said to me, why on earth are you doing this? You know, why would you give up a career in television? You know, that's an amazing thing to do. And all my medical school interviews, without fail, every single one, the first question was, why do you want to give up television? As though, you know, TV, the media, sort of public platforms, they all carry a lot of cachet in modern society, and so does medicine, of a different kind, but perhaps it's whittling away. And I think I was very, very nervous, very apprehensive. I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I'd be any good at it. I was worried I might be squeamish. I wouldn't know what to say to patients. God forbid I should ever see a patient who was dying. How on earth do you know what to say to someone who's dying? I was terrified of palliative medicine as a student. But happily, I found it completely liberating. And I remember on day one of medical school sitting in the middle of the front row, so keen. And I spent the day listening to those sort of introductory lectures, just thinking, good God, what a privilege to be embarking on a career that enables you to be there in what are some of the most frightening, traumatic, significant days of people's life in a way that's therapeutic, or you hope will be therapeutic. And I just, from day one, I felt like I was me, and I was kind of doing something that felt true to me in this really wonderful, incredible way.
Amazing. And that takes me back a bit. When I went to my first days at Dundee University Medical School, because I'd come from Germany, all fresh-faced and with a much stronger German accent than I have now. And
we may yet mention the war.
Oh, do you remember that? That was fantastic. For reference, when I last saw Rachel, it was at the Palliative Care Congress in Edinburgh, and Rachel was also doing an In Conversation event, but with Rob Delaney, the Hollywood actor, and yeah, I asked a question at the end, and then out of nothing he brought up the war, and then I said, did you have to bring up the war? But it was all okay. But it was a funny shared moment, and I got him a ginger nut biscuit later on as well, because he was quite hungry during the book signing, I think. But yeah, so yeah, I was there, and I was hiding in the back rows a little bit, because it was also new, and I couldn't understand a lot of the people with their strong Scottish accents. And in Dundee, they kind of release you onto the wards in first year as well. So I remember, I think it was with Camilla. She was a Norwegian medical student, also in her first year, just as apprehensive as me, because we were foreigners going onto the wards and supposed to interview or get a history from this Dundonian chap. And I don't know if you find Dundonian accents easy, Rachel, but it was a real
You couldn't
struggle.
understand a word they were saying.
No, I couldn't, and I just needed. Luckily, one of the consultants took pity. I think it was Dr. Butler, and he came along and he sort of did a bit of translating. I was asking things like, how many? Hi, Shabri. Oh, well, she's gone again. I think she's got a dodgy line. She comes in and out, Shabri does. I know her well, so she's probably on a dodgy line there. But he would cook. I was supposed to elicit how many cigarettes this guy smokes. So I said, how many cigarettes do you smoke? And I didn't ken pal. I was like, and then Dr. Butler said, that means didn't ken pal. That means I don't know, mate. But yeah, so you were a front rower, I was a back rower. So I was hiding. Yeah. But yeah, good memories there. And then how come palliative care? Was there a specific moment, or was it a slow process?
So I always thought, even before I went to medical school, that I would want to work with patients who were really sick, who had cancer, or perhaps were dying, even though I was terrified of encountering those patients. I kind of wanted to work with very sick patients, I think because I was making the transition to medicine sort of 10 years after everyone else. It's a lot to give up a well-paid career and go back to being a student and penniless and all of those things. And I was interested in really sick patients, because there you have extreme physiology and extreme psychology, the psychological impact of disease, and I found that most interesting. And very quickly, once I got onto the wards, which, you know, I did much later, a few years into my degree, it really quickly became apparent in a hospital setting that certain patients commanded the attention and the interest of the doctors, and certain patients were sort of shunted to the sidelines. And in the first category, of course, were the sort of exciting, potentially sexy diagnoses. You know, this person could have an aortic dissection or a pheochromocytoma, because I went to Oxford, and, you know, that was the holy grail as far as we were all concerned there. Yeah. And then in the margins, overlooked to some extent, were the majority of the patients, who were often very elderly, who had come in with a UTI and delirium, nothing terribly exciting in a medical sense, but actually were human beings who seemed to be getting quite a raw deal. And I noticed in particular that cancer patients were sometimes not even dealt a diagnosis badly. They sort of worked out themselves what was going on almost. And no one seemed to want to sit down and confront with them the fact that life as they knew it had been overturned by this diagnosis of cancer, and cancer's often picked up on the acute medical or surgical take. And I could see these patients who were in huge need, and they didn't seem to be of great interest or value to a lot of professionals in the hospital, and they were really vulnerable. And sometimes, because they were really ill, especially if they're approaching the end of life, they literally physically did not have a loud voice or any voice. And I didn't like that. And I'm naturally someone who kind of gravitates towards where the need is. I think that was part of why I wanted to be a doctor. Patients are vulnerable, and as a doctor, we have a great role, I think, as an advocate for our patients. Yeah. And I saw this group who just were not getting a good enough deal, not necessarily because anyone was doing anything wrong, but for all kinds of complicated reasons around how medicine is taught and people's confidence about death and dying and so on. And I think the fact that I was so afraid of those patients myself, which I was to begin with, almost made me perversely gravitate towards them. I'm the kind of person who likes to, if I'm frightened of something or I'm no good at it, then that means I want to figure out how to do it. And I started to find that the absolute joys of palliative care around plucking up the courage to not think about yourself and just focus on the patient and just sit with them and hear their story, and the incredible privilege of hearing a patient talk to you about their diagnosis and what it meant for their life was the one of the most moving things I'd ever experienced in my life.
Yeah. And I guess, Rachel, you are the sort of person who, when you hear the words that can't be done for the patient, you get an instant reaction. And when you hear the words nothing further can be done for this patient, you equally get a reaction. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm sure that strikes a chord with you.
Totally. So I believe passionately, and I think I believed this maybe even before I became a doctor. I believed in the abstract that this is something medicine should be capable of. I believe, as someone who's now been a doctor for 15 years, that there is always something we can do for our patients, one of our patients, and that is because we are human beings as well as doctors. And no matter how bad and bleak and wretched someone's situation, a human being always has within themselves the power to make it better for somebody else. And that isn't necessarily a medical power. So we as doctors are very lucky because we have that power in virtue of our humanity. And we also have this vast array of drugs and interventions and technologies and clever modern medical interventions that can help tremendously. But I think one of the things that is just an endless source of joy and infectious enthusiasm in palliative medicine is you get to push the boundaries of medicine, and sometimes medicine is about the right dose of morphine. Sometimes it's about making sure that that patient has prescribed their evening gin and tonic in a glass tumbler with ice, a slice of lemon if we can find one and nick one from the ward anywhere every day, because actually they're in the last week of their life and that gin makes them feel like a human being even as they die. And sometimes it expands to the boundaries of getting a prize-winning bull on a trailer pulled by a tractor, secretly driven into the hospital grounds so that a farmer who is dying of cancer can say goodbye to the being that his wife has admitted he loves most of all in the world, i.e. more than her, and that was his prize-winning bull. And you can do, amazing. But you can do those things and you can break the rules. I mean, it's probably usually best to tell your hospital trust that you're doing something as ambitious as that. But I find also sometimes it's best not to.
It's you also, I mean, I'm lucky. I work in Velindre and they love it when I come up with stuff like that, or when the team
presumably
comes up with
bulls are do you not have pet ward bulls on every ward? I think
I've not pulled that one yet. I really
therapy bulls.
I really want to get a few bulls involved now, but but I think we've done dogs and I want to say possibly even a horse locally. And I mean, and pushing the boundaries, you said, I mean, you don't only push the boundaries of the hospital trust or the organization, but also with phone calls. I remember many years ago phoning Cardiff City Stadium, about getting someone there for a specific concert that they wanted to see, or sporting event and things like that. And sometimes you know, some people say, well, you're a doctor, you shouldn't get involved in that sort of thing, but you want to, and it kind of makes it just gives something to your day, doesn't it?
You never forget it, do you? And there's something about almost the creativity of it. And
totally agree.
Discovering that with all your medical training, with a little bit of imagination and creativity, which are not typically qualities that are encouraged in medicine. You know, we need to be evidence-based and sadly protocol-driven in lots of ways. Protocols can be very good, but it's great to be able to think creatively. And in a hospice I used to work in, I had this occupational therapist who was just brilliant. And we had a word operation, and if we were going to enact an operation, it meant we were undertaking a brilliantly ambitious task on behalf of a patient. And so we had, you know, we would have Operation Royal Flush was getting a 95-year-old to her bridge club one more time before she died, and that kind of thing is just a joy, and patients love it, and everyone loves it. Everyone gets behind them.
I'm nowhere near where I'm supposed to be in my questions.
Sorry.
That I wrote down. It's great. No, I love it. It's really good. And who cares anyway? Let's throw away the script. We're in conversation with each other. But I was interested in your views on 21st century palliative care. I mean, you can read a lot about the history of palliative care and how it extends backwards and what has been done in the past. So when I entered palliative care, I felt sometimes, and you talked about being an advocate for the patients as well. Sometimes I had to be an advocate against over-investigation and maybe too much medicine, and perhaps maybe sometimes talking to the colleagues who kind of maybe couldn't see the wood for the trees, and the patient was on a conveyor belt, and it can happen to the best of us. And I think maybe over the last 2 or 3 years, and I don't know if the pandemic has come into it, I feel there's nearly maybe it's just me, but the transition has happened where nearly the opposite is happening now. Now I sometimes feel like the unreasonable person who suggests another MRI scan or a stent for a patient sometimes, and that's happening more and more. And I'm nearly finding myself at the opposite end of what I once was and was there for, and I was advocating for. Have you experienced that?
That's very interesting, Mark, and I that really resonates. Actually, I think that in the last decade there's been tremendous and really positive and admirable recognition across the board in medicine and nursing, but particularly medicine, that there has been a problem with kind of paternalistic doctors making decisions on behalf of patients or making assumptions about continuing life-prolonging treatments without necessarily pausing to check whether or not that is actually what the patient wants or in their best interest based on the patient's agenda. Because at the end of the day, that's the only agenda that matters. And that's a tremendous advance. But I think, like you, I often these days will find myself in a scenario, and I now work in hospital palliative medicine, where almost the opposite assumption has been made. This patient has got a diagnosis of incurable cancer, and they've come into hospital, so we need to stop everything and allow them to die in dignity. And I might find myself sort of saying, could we please just, you know, do these tests to rule out reversible causes of deterioration? So, for instance, a very high calcium is very hard to distinguish from sometimes from a terminal decline in a patient. And I think in a way that is, I think that's a good thing, because these dilemmas and decisions are very nuanced, and they're sometimes very difficult to unpick. And the general principle always of ensuring that your patient's the most important person in the room, and their agenda is the starting point, and what matters to them should be the beginning of every conversation you have, is a way of unpicking all of that. But that's a very, very radical about turn to the way medicine used to be taught. Used to
work, that's right. And it also involves good education for that patient. You might have to sort of say, look, I'm thinking about this scan for you, and it would involve 45 minutes in a scanner, and but these are the things that I would want to sort of see and find, and possibly we could then do something about. Or but these are the risks of going down for an MRI scan, and then working it through together. But they need that education, that understanding that they don't know how long an MRI scan takes. They don't know
exactly.
You need to take it back as one of my key rules for the medical students. If you have a puzzle or a conundrum or something you can't work out as an MDT, walk back to the patient's bedside, sit there until you find the answer, and that it usually does give you the answer.
Exactly. And it's like that famous line from William Osler, you know, the great 19th century physician, who one of his most famous lectures, which he gave to medical students at the time, he said, just listen to your patient. He is telling you the diagnosis. And nearly all of the time that's the case, isn't it? But the sort of the extreme listening is the thing that much of the medical system stamps out, because that requires time and energy and an approach which is not necessarily taught as well as it could be.
You're right, yeah. On that topic as well, so Dr. Paul Keeley, so Dr. Crouchback on Twitter has asked, do palliative care teams induce learned helplessness and de-skilling?
I saw him ask that question on Twitter and I thought it was a brilliant question. And I think the answer to some degree is yes, because once you have, when everybody is busy and there are too few staff and too many patients, it's obviously a temptation to make use of every specialist service that exists because you're run ragged all of the time. And if you perceive end of life stuff as being difficult, time consuming, and potentially requiring skills that you don't feel confident you have, of course you're going to want to get in touch with that specialist service. You know, I am not going to attempt to figure out fluid balance in an end stage renal failure without getting in touch with the renal team, for instance. But of course there's a danger that in those interactions with the specialist palliative care team, you end up reinforcing your own idea that you're no good at this. And so my vision for British medicine would be one in which you and I don't exist, Mark. We have written ourselves out of a job because we have upskilled everybody in the medical profession to such an extent that palliative care is everyone's business and everyone is good at it, and there's no need for anyone like us. I mean, obviously we'll have, you know, that's a sort of fanciful theoretical idea, but I think I try and ensure that every encounter I have, every referral with a patient and a team in the hospital, I will deliberately ask the junior doctor or the nurse or the consultant what they would do, what their thinking is, so that it is shared care, and I'm trying to make it a mini teaching opportunity, because actually I think the biggest barrier to good palliative care across the NHS is lack of confidence. And we need to be building that, because there are not enough palliative care specialists to support the 500,000+ people who die in Britain every year. We need to be in the proactive business of upskilling our colleagues.
I mean, I'm so lucky. I feel so lucky because I work in a setting where I've got some fantastic palliative care nurses I work with here at Llandoch and in Velindre as well, and also the teams there are really well set up. So it is rare that I've been on the wards this morning. I had a student with me, for instance, and then I've interacted with lots of junior doctors, and I've kind of told them exactly what I've done and why I've done it. Tomorrow I've got a ward round and I'll have junior doctors come along. There'll be junior doctors in Velindre who are working in oncology, and if they know the patient, I say, why don't you just come along and we'll see the patient together, and you can do your bits that you have to do for your daily activities and I can do my bits, and then we kind of riff off each other and we learn from each other. But it's this learned helplessness, this de-skilling, it's a common topic that we discuss about also with the nursing team as well, and they try really hard to kind of upskill all the other nurses on things like syringe drivers and things like that, and various other things. And it works sometimes, other times maybe it doesn't work so well. I think it's a mix, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other thing that I think goes a long way is positive reinforcement and saying well done when someone's done a good job. So I occasionally, when one of the junior doctors, for instance, has really thought about a patient and has been really worried about their care and has got the team involved and really gone the extra mile themselves, I'll send an email to the medical director of my trust saying, I really want you to be aware of this doctor and what they have done, and I just think it exemplifies the best care. Because I think for that junior doctor, that's a wonderful bit of positive feedback. But also, my secret strategy is, if I do enough of these, the medical director is going to subliminally get the message that from the top down, palliative care is everyone's business, and we'll start kind of, you know, promoting it from the top as well. And I just think saying well done is one of the things that the NHS suffers, the absence of which the NHS suffers from terribly. We can all do it more, and people respond to encouragement and positive feedback, and it doesn't cost anything to do that. But boy, it really helps people's confidence with palliative medicine, doesn't it?
I tell you what, Rachel, I mean, if there's one output from this meeting, including people learning about igloo and mouth ulcers, but there's one output. Everyone who's live in this meeting right now has to, by the end of this month, and there's not many days to go, have said thank you or well done to someone, either verbally or by email or in written correspondence. Ideally in written correspondence, so it would be lovely. Everyone has that homework. I'm going to do it myself as well, and if I recognize anyone in this meeting here, I'm gonna bring them in as well, basically. So
excellent.
and they can say thank you or well done to someone, because I think you're right. We often neglect that, or we just get swept up. And sometimes I think, oh, I should really commend that medical student or that junior doctor or that nurse on what they did. That was amazing. And then you put that in writing, and just it doesn't take long. It really doesn't take long when you ping it off.
Yeah,
that's a really good one. Rachel, a slightly different topic now. So, I mean, the murky world of social media. I mean, we love it, we hate it, but some of the stuff you've said to me has really shocked me in terms of what you have to put up with. And feel free not to mention some of the stuff. But I mean, have we reached a level of usefulness with Twitter? Is it still good? I mean, or does it fuel conspiracies? #Mudazalam, #DNR, #Liverpool Care Pathway. Is it just driving people nuts?
It's really sad, isn't it? Because it can be so good and so wonderful. And I'm only really active on Twitter, and I love I love many aspects of the medical community on Twitter, the wider community. You know, Tony Duffy is you know, who does, for those who don't know, in this meeting, the most wonderful educational palliative care Twitter threads, which are just magnificent. You know, your Twitter feed is a joy. There are so many doctors, scientists that I would never have connected with and would never have known about were it not for Twitter, and I love that. And I do believe that most people come to social media to connect because we're social beings, and most people are good and decent, and they're not sort of horrifically abusive anti-vaxxers. However, you only need a small number of the latter to make life very, very unpleasant, augmented by, you know, 100 million bots from Russia and China. And I'm someone who I get a huge amount of abuse. I never really used to, particularly when I only tweeted about Jeremy Hunt in the days of the original junior doctor strikes. I didn't really encounter much abuse on social media. I used to tweet a lot about Brexit. I was devastated by how bad Brexit was for the NHS, and I got a bit of abuse from that. But with COVID, the abuse from COVID deniers, the scamdemic merchants, and then the anti-vaxxers has been absolutely incredible, to the extent that I've had so many threats, death threats, rape threats, that I at one stage had to get the police involved because of concerns about my safety. And that it's insane to me even saying that NHS doctors could possibly face that degree of abuse for something as innocuous as advocating vaccination. But there we are. That's the world we live in. It's a strange world, and sometimes I feel I don't understand it. But the one thing I believe is you've got to have skin in the game. You have to engage, because once you disengage and you've given up, then the game is lost. Hope is a doing word.
Yeah.
To feel hopeful, you have to do things, you have to engage, you have to try. And I know that for all those abusive individuals, I always think of them as trolls in their underpants, sitting at home, tapping away bravely on their keyboards. For all those people, there are other people who are incredibly grateful for everybody who's trying to the best of their abilities to spread good, important, evidence-based information, whether that's about midazolam or COVID or a vaccination. And they really crave that information in the same way that I crave information on social media, and I'm not going to allow trolls to stop me trying to provide that.
And please don't stop, because I think if you think about all the things you do and say and put out there, it contributes to the debate. It creates a bit of balance somewhere, what we all do in a sense. But also, if you look at then in the feed and then the nasty things that are said, and there's 15 individuals who've said something nasty, but then you look at the impressions of the tweet and it's had like 16,000 impressions, you kind of think, oh, actually, a lot of people are reading this, and I'm sure most people would find this abhorrent, but maybe they found my tweet interesting and they took some information from it in a sense. It's like a weird open forum teaching session or education session maybe, where you can put your views forward, or a type of view forward. And of course, you're going to get some abuse, but if you can somehow trick your mind into thinking, or not even trick your mind, but get your mind to thinking, well, this is only sort of 0.1% or so, but maybe the other lot are really listening and engaging in this, then maybe there's a bit of hope there. I don't know. Exactly.
And I mean, just as an example of that, so if you remember last year, the tragic Archie Battersby case, so this was a case of I think he was 12, boy who had been injured and ended up almost certainly brain dead, but there were complications with the testing, and there was a great fight between Great Ormond Street, his trust, and his family about withdrawing life support in intensive care. And it was a sort of one of those horribly controversial cases that was front page of the newspapers. And I remember right in the end, I didn't comment on it publicly at all for a long time, until the point at which his life prolonging treatment was withdrawn. But after that happened, I felt that the quality of the mainstream journalism about that case was so poor and misunderstood so fundamentally what was happening, and therefore feeding into the abuse that his team of paediatricians was receiving at Great Ormond Street. I remember writing a very, very carefully worded Twitter thread explaining the key issues and linking to NHS evidence. And it took quite a long time to do, but it had the most phenomenal impact from members of the public saying, thank you for explaining this. I didn't understand this. And I had this palpable sense of people out there really wanting to understand, not getting it, and being grateful, you know, that a doctor bothered to try and articulate that. And it's a good example of how Twitter isn't just toxic, it's not just a cesspit, it's very, very valuable, and there are lots of good people on there.
Well, we're lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have your expertise and your prior journalistic knowledge and now your medical knowledge. So thank you. Just, you know, on behalf of everyone, thank you very much, Rachel. And that certainly isn't the end of the meeting, by the way. I want to bring in another a special guest today, who's also active on Twitter, all the way from Hollywood to see his Welsh football team get promoted. Oh no, sorry, that's the wrong one. All the way from Swansea, the clinical lead of the Palliative Care End of Life Care Programme Board, Idris Baker, is here, and I thought it'd be lovely to bring him into this meeting. I love Idris. He's a great guy. As a really sage head, often can get really good advice from him about palliative care matters, and I thoroughly recommend people follow his Twitter feed as well, which at times is informative, other times it's funny. So Idris, I thought I wanted to bring you in maybe, and if you have a few questions for Rachel today.
Thank you, Mark, and hello, Rachel. I turned my camera off when you started talking about Hollywood. I thought maybe I'd been relegated, but yeah, it's nice to be, and it's fascinating to listen to this conversation. I don't know whether to be more grateful to Rachel for your work, your courage in facing down some of what you and Mark have been talking about, or more grateful to Mark for sparing us all his other maladies, which he could have been talking about. The nation has suffered enough, but it's really fascinating to listen to this. And I guess I've been thinking, because I mean, you acknowledged at the start, we're sitting, or at least most of us, Rachel, you don't have this blessing today of actually being this side of the border, but most of us, I think, on this call do. And I was thinking about, you know, the way stories and people's stories have influenced, I mean, quite a bit of what you've talked about already, and clearly, Rachel, so much of your own work in writing as well as in medicine. And I guess, you know, we've got a particular set of traditions, like some of the other Celtic nations, but particularly in Wales, I think maybe more strongly in some Welsh-speaking communities and among Welsh speakers about storytelling. Rachel, you've been engaged in listening to people's stories and relating people's stories. What do you pick up about the differences that, you know, maybe different people in different cultures, different contexts have about how they use stories? What can we learn from that? What can we do with that? I mean, maybe we have so much in common. I don't know, but what do you find?
It's so interesting. There's that expression, and I ought to know who said this, and I don't know who to attribute it to, but that life is lived forwards but only understood backwards. And I like that expression up to a point, but I don't think it's really true, because I think life is both lived and understood through story. We don't chronologically go from cradle to grave. We are telling ourselves a story about our life every step of the way, and what the meaning of our life is, what matters. It's an experience that is lived through meanings, and the meanings come from the story we're telling ourselves every step of the way. And that's when you reflect back on someone's life, that's how you understand it as well, as a story. There's a reason why the hero narrative is the classic narrative from sort of Greek mythology to Hollywood. This is how we understand ourselves as individuals with motivations and weaknesses and flaws and strengths. And I think in palliative medicine especially, it's really important to remember that, perhaps in all parts of medicine, in the sense that when you encounter a patient, you are meeting somebody who potentially their diagnosis, a new diagnosis, has completely disrupted their biography, their sense of themselves and the story they tell themselves about who they are. So, you know, the classic example would be a sort of fit, healthy Welsh prop in rugby who gets an injury and you know, damages their spine and then ends up paraplegic in a wheelchair. They've suddenly, everything they thought that they told themselves in their own story has been disrupted by that. And if you have a terminal diagnosis, then the sense of yourself as someone with a future has been disrupted. And I just think that stories, from the word go, the first time, you know, a parent or a caregiver says those words, once upon a time, that is how you are taught to view the world. That is the prism. And I actually think perhaps culture to culture, different prominence may be placed on the importance and power of storytelling. But I think it's a human universal. Is there any culture that doesn't understand itself and individuals themselves through story? No, I think story is what resonates to us more than anything. It's why politicians very cleverly will try and tell voters stories that they think they will be able to persuade them of a vision of themselves or their country through that story. It's because stories are so powerful.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was thinking as you were talking about some of the stories we hear, I mean, we hear them in different settings, don't we? I used to have to manage quite a lot of complaints, not all of them about me, I'm glad to say. But they're telling a story, aren't they? When people raise concerns or when they
Yeah.
raise compliments and when they tell us what's been happening with them. And I've known people sometimes look at some of the stories or listen even to the stories that people tell and try to take them apart line by line and find the inaccuracies and the inconsistencies. And I've always found it fascinating to be able to stand back from that and look at the bigger picture. And sometimes there's quite a bit of metaphor mixed in, and that's not literally how it happened, but you can see the much bigger thread of what someone's actually trying to relay. I think that's sometimes part of what you've been able to capture, isn't it, Rachel?
Yeah, and the sense that your task in that situation, and definitely the task that we as doctors have in clinical situations, it's actually a task of interpretation. You are almost reading your patient's body and words, in the sense that you are trying to distill meaning from them. What are they really telling me when they say X? What is their body telling me? What is the meaning of this rash in conjunction with this fever? I think medicine is a very interpretive enterprise that's actually akin to analysing a text, to reading a text, but it's not taught in that way. You're not encouraged to think as a student that that is an important part of what you're trying to do. And I think a good example relating to complaints is that of the angry patient or relative. I always think to myself, when someone is very, very angry, and we often encounter angry patients in palliative medicine for obvious reasons, what is really motivating them? They are probably frightened. Almost always, I think fear is underpins anger, and I always assume that there is something I need to try and understand rather than react to, you know, an angry patient, for instance, because invariably there's a story that lies beneath it, and your job is to almost make a kind of empathetic, imaginative leap to see the facts that are being articulated through that person's perspective. That's the way to find a resolution.
And really being able to listen to it is what allows you to get there, isn't it? I know we have certainly some people in this part of the world. I work a little bit further west than Mark, and you know, a higher proportion of people who are Welsh speaking or bilingual, and a lot of them will say, well, you know, I could tell you my story in English, I could tell you my story in Welsh. It's a different story, because how I express myself in the two languages is different. How I express myself, not only because it's my preferred language, Welsh, but actually because the means of expression and the kind of language with a small L we might use is a little bit different. And again, I find it a fascinating example. Sometimes it's not literally about which of two languages is it, maybe what form of words, but even in that very stark choice of, you know, okay, which language do I actually get to use? Yeah. Because expressing myself is different.
I love that. And of course, that makes me think about all the patients in hospital or a healthcare setting who are not able to tell their story in their language, their means of expression of choice, because we, the healthcare providers, lack those languages, and that could be Welsh or Urdu or Makaton, whatever it is. The layers of challenge and difficulty for patients, because we do not have the means to understand them in the way that ideally we should be able to, but of course those barriers are there, and it's ever so easy to forget about that because it's not your experience if you are someone who speaks the dominant language. It's one of the reasons why I can't bear on social media people, whenever there's a discussion about NHS funding, you'll get choruses of people saying, if you didn't spend it all on diversity managers, there wouldn't be a problem, which is A, stupid, and B, so misses the point. It's unbelievable.
I mean, yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, how language codifies things, how we all tell our stories, and what it just said just now resonates so much. You know, there's a story in that. You know, you could probably write a lovely article about that, Idris, called Welsh Whispers or something like that, and how these things can sometimes, you know, be be locked to someone like me who isn't a Welsh speaker yet. I'm sort of learning, but that's fascinating. Moving from Wales to Ukraine, Rachel, I've had so many questions. I'm not going to be able to fit them in. John's reminded me that we've got a time limit for this meeting, but Hospice Ukraine, and I talking about bravery as well. You went to Ukraine at a difficult time with Henry Marsh, and yeah, tell us a bit about that, please.
Yeah, well, in October last year, I went to Ukraine for two reasons. There was a kind of excuse and a real reason, and the excuse was my book about palliative medicine, Dear Life, was published in October last year in Ukraine. It was meant to be published the week that Putin invaded, so it got postponed. But there was a book festival in Ukraine that happened every year, and the organisers decided to go ahead with it despite the war. And the publishers got in touch with me and some other authors about the idea of trying to go out to this book festival, which I was desperate to do as a means of supporting Ukraine, and also realised was a wonderful opportunity to try to connect with palliative care teams in Ukraine. So I'd done a little bit of teaching remotely with Ukrainian medical students who had all had to leave the country last year. And Henry Marsh, the neurosurgeon and author, has been going to Ukraine for 30 years and has lots of amazing links, and so was able to link me to some hospices and palliative care teams. And we set off on this trip with some other UK authors, thinking that the risks would be very remote. The war had been relatively quiescent. But unfortunately, as we travelled into Kyiv, the capital, on a night train, as we were pretty much on the brink of pulling into the city, there was a massive missile attack that coincided with the arrival of our train. So we literally, our phones were lighting up with sort of images of missiles landing on Kyiv as we arrived, and we sort of were herded with men with guns almost at gunpoint down into the bomb shelters underneath the station, and then pretty much spent the rest of the day in bomb shelters. And 6 or 7 people were killed that day by these missiles. So that was really not what I had set out to do. Very, very frightening. But I was in Ukraine in total for a week. And I went to an incredible hospice, met some incredible teams, and saw just the way in which the war was affecting the entire population. I think I thought of war as something that really only affected the people on the front lines. And actually, you could be 1,000 kilometres away in a town that was ostensibly safe, and yet every day coffins were being brought back from the front line containing the bodies of sort of teenagers, 18-year-old boys who had been killed and had been repatriated. And I in the hospice, they were receiving repatriated soldiers and so on. And all of cancer care has been incredibly disrupted, all of palliative care, and there isn't that much to begin with, incredibly disrupted. And so seeing all of this just made me want to try and set up a charity to help, and Hospice Ukraine was launched a few weeks ago, and I hope you don't mind me doing a plug, but we have got on the 6th of June, the evening of the 6th of June in London, at the Royal Society of Medicine, we have our launch event, which is a live event with wonderful speakers. Adam Kay is doing some comedy, David Knott, the war surgeon, will be there, Henry Marsh will be there, I'll be there, and tickets to the event are £20, and all of the money will go to palliative care teams in Ukraine. So please come if you can, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, it sounds like a fantastic event. And there's the Hospice Ukraine Twitter account as well, if people want to follow that. And yeah, I think sadly we've kind of overrun a little bit. So terrible organising from myself, basically. John,
because I talk too much, sorry.
No, not at all. No. It's just very interesting to listen to you and everything you said. John, did you receive any correspondence or anything in the chat, which I haven't been monitoring, I will say?
There were no questions in the chat, Mark, but just lots of admiration, Rachel, for your comments, particularly about the use of language, the importance of empathy and kindness, all of those things. And I know you mentioned that in your book, Dear Life, don't you, about small acts of kindness. And yeah, just lots of appreciation for the fantastic things you've been telling us this afternoon. So thank you so much.
We're hoping to put the recording of this In Conversation event onto YouTube for Dying Matters Awareness Week, Rachel.
Brilliant.
And then we'll sort of spread it a little bit so more people can see it, and those people who are busy working today who might not have been able to see it have an opportunity to catch up with it then and see your words and hear from you directly.
And your mouth ulcers might go global, and soon my secret shares in Igloo will make me a millionaire.
I'm glad you didn't say that my hemorrhoids would go global.
Well, I was going to, but yeah, very good.
And on that bombshell, I'd like to thank. Oh no, I shouldn't have said that. That's me falling right into that trap. On that, I'd like to thank everyone today. I'd like to thank everyone who's attended and given us their time. I'd like to thank John very much for chairing the meeting so expertly. I'd like to thank Idris for coming in, and most of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Rachel, for giving up your time and talking to us. And it's just been really fascinating and a lovely way to catch up with you as well.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. Lovely to talk to you, Mark and Idris and John. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye
Thank you, Rachel.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.